Good morning to everyone who's here. Welcome to this NEC4 bite-sized training session. It's been set up with YORhub and East Riding of Yorkshire Council. For those that don't know me, my name's Mike Raven. I'm the YORhub Digital Lead and Sustainability Manager. And my day job is a principal project manager at East Riding Council. So I use NEC4 on a daily basis. Just in terms of YORhub, for anyone who's interested in how the framework support digital construction and sustainability, do please get in touch with me. Very happy to talk to anyone. But today's session is focused on NEC4. The YORhub suite of frameworks, they've been based on the NEC forms of contract since their creation. All of the frameworks have standard call-off NEC contracts available, and it's fully compatible with all of the NEC primary and secondary options. So if you would like to find out more about any of that, then please do check out yorhub.com. There's myself and a full team of colleagues who are very, very experienced procurement and construction professionals who can advise on that. Any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A function in Zoom, and depending on the questions, we'll either pick them up as we go or we'll go through them at the end. We're joined today by Alec Kowalski. Now, Alec is a chartered civil engineer with Mott MacDonald with over 2 decades of experience. Alec specialises in NEC forms of contract and has delivered NEC training for a number of years now, including to myself previously. So I'm very much looking forward to today's session. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Alec.
Thank you very much, Mike. Please let me know if any time if the IT fails me. So I'm going to have a go and share the screen. Click there. Okay, so hopefully that's sharing.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we're going to focus today on compensation events. So this is me looking very official and neat and tidy at work when I'm in the office. And yes, as Mike said, my background is as a civil engineer. I've also gone on and got chartered with the Institute of Arbitrators, just, you know, for the lols. And I've got 20 years experience, and I've been doing the NEC contracts for quite a while, quite a large portion of that. This is our disclaimer I have to put up just to let you all know this is not legal, financial, insurance advice or in any way. So this is just for information purposes. You know, we don't expect accepting liability and things for decisions you make based on this training, although I do hope you find it useful. So there's 2 things we're going to look at in the presentation today. I'm going to look at a short piece on risk allocation pre-award, because that is going to help identify how change is managed once the contract's up and running. Everything you do in procurement sets the stage for how the project is going to run. So decisions we make then will affect how change is managed throughout the life of the contract. And then I'm going to go through the actual compensation process itself. So how do we manage change? What are the timescales? What are the important things to look out for? Okay, so why do we even go through any of this? Okay, so the client has made a decision to invest in good project management, okay, which means we've gone for an NEC contract. And NEC contracts were written back in the day, the original one was written by a project manager. So it works for us. The contracts works for us as project managers. If any of you have probably end of financial year, you've been wrestling with your accounting system and it doesn't work for you, it doesn't do what you want it to do, and it doesn't make a lot of sense because it wasn't written for you. It was written for the accountants. So the accountants are very happy, but we struggle with the financial software. Not so with the NEC. It's written by project managers for project managers to use. So we're going to hire or employ a project manager to execute that role under the NEC contract to give us control of the project. It's all about control. We don't want to end up in a massive legal fight at the end of the job where we have no idea what our costs are spiraling into. We want control, and the NEC contract gives us that. So let's think about in the procurement process. Okay, so when we think about risk allocation, the first thing you do when you are procuring your NEC contract is which option are we going to pick? We've got, and the options do 2 things. They set out how the price is going to be built up, So whether that's on an activity schedule or a bill of quantities or such like, and how the contractor is going to get paid. Are they going to get paid on option A, where it's payment on completed activities, or are they going to be using a target contract, something like option C, where it's open book and we go through their costs every single month and they justify all their costs as we go along? The very selection of one of those options determines the allocations of quantity risk and efficiency risk. So if we think about one end of the scale, option A, a lot of the risk is transferred onto the contractor. So then they price in that risk, and potentially you get a higher price than if you were using one of the target contracts like an option C. But that means that the contractor is going to carry the quantity risk and the efficiency risk. They give you a price for an activity, and that's the price you pay. Whether it costs the contractor more or less, you don't get to know. That's none of your business. That's for the contractor to worry about. So you're going to pay the price for completed activities. If we go all the way to the other end of the scale and we talk about option E, that's a cost reimbursable option. The contractor carries almost no risk. The client is going to hold the quantity risk and the efficiency risk. You're going to pay the contractor for whatever they do. Okay, so option E, much more suited to things like emergency works, or where works, the scope is really not very clear, because in those circumstances, the contractor would price in lots and lots of risk, which is perhaps not the most efficient way to price things. So we've already made a decision when we've picked our main option about how we're going to share risk between the client and the contractor. There are also other ways of sharing risk, and these come from the secondary options, and they're for very specific risk allocations. So if we think about inflation, for years, inflation really hasn't been much of an issue. Probably nobody gave it much thought. Not so these days. It's very much, the landscape has changed. So who carries the risk for inflation? If you don't select option X1, the contractor carries the risk for inflation, and their prices will reflect that. So if you're like, no, I want a keener price, and I want the client, us, to take the risk of inflation, you include option X1. And so on and so forth. There are a lot more options you can choose, and you can allocate risk accordingly. But for specific events, we have what's called the compensation event process. Okay, so the compensation events are events which happen when they occur and they don't arise from the contractor's fault. That's very important. If they're not the contractor's fault, they entitle the contractor to be compensated for any effect it has on the prices, key dates, and the completion date. So time and money, basically. Okay, this is the contractor's only rights to change the prices and the completion date. So this is the only way they can do it without fundamentally altering the contract. And that would require a renegotiation of the whole thing between the client and the contractor. So that does happen, but much more rarely. So generally speaking, the only way that we alter the prices and the dates is through the implementation of compensation events. If you guys are doing any other sort of other project management courses, things like Sigma 6, Prince 2, APM, these sorts of things, they have their own methods of change control. And that's what we're talking about here, change control. But here, it's baked into the contract. It's a contract process. You might be doing it anyway if you were doing, say, APM or Prince 2, because that's just good project management. And I'm sure those of you out there are managing your projects well, you must have a change control process. But here, it's a contract process as well. So there are obligations under the contract saying we have to do this. So where do they come from? So where would you go to look up these compensation events? Your first stop is clause 60.1, and under the NEC4, there are 21 listed events. So that's clear. That's in the unamended contract. Any of you can pick that up and read that, and those are all in the standard contract. If you use options B and D, these are the bill of quantities options. So there are 3 more compensation rent clauses specifically associated with bill of quantities. So you have to look those up in the sections of the contract specific to options B or D if you're using those. Obviously, if you're not, if you're using activity schedules, you don't have a bill of quantities, so these won't appear. There are also compensation rents from those secondary option clauses. So if we think about X2 was a change in the law. So if a change in the law happens, you know, in accordance with this this clause, that will trigger a compensation event. And there are various others. I don't intend to go through these, but these are just demonstrating there are various others in the secondary options. So it's another place you can look for compensation event triggers. And there are additional compensations can be listed out in contract data part 1. Okay, now the 21 noted here, these are about changes in the scope, but generic. That could be anything, any way in which the project manager instructs a change to the scope. It doesn't say what they are. It's any change to the scope. The vast majority of the other compensation clauses are about the function of the contract. None of them will say anything specifically about your project because they can't. It's a printed contract. How would the writers of NEC know whether you're doing a bridge or a culvert or a reservoir or a highway or whatever? They don't know. Those sorts of things are specific to your project. So how do we allocate risk specific to your project? We do that in a section in contract data part 1. And you can specifically list out these events, if they occur, will trigger compensation events. So here we can get down into the detail. We can talk about the presence of asbestos. We could talk about great crested newts or roosting bats, or perhaps some risk associated with trains if you're doing a railway project, or the traffic flow on a highway if you're dealing with a highways project. So here we can get specific and we can introduce compensation events specific to your project. And this is really powerful. This is a really good way of doing things because this means you don't need your lawyers to come in and write lengthy amendments to the contract, which then could be confusing or misinterpreted. Here, you just list things out and you say, if asbestos is discovered, it will trigger a compensation event. If there are great crested newts on the site, it will trigger a compensation event. And the contract mechanisms that already exist for change control, then you just use those. We don't have to write specific mechanisms for additional risks. We just say these will trigger them. So this is where we look for the standard compensation rate clauses, and we can add ones specific to our projects. Now, Z clauses are where the lawyers have got involved and they have added additional clauses or they've modified how the existing clauses will operate. So it's possible that they've been introduced here. And if your scope contains any assumptions, now I would advise against this. I would advise you to make your scope as detailed and as clear as possible. I would avoid assumptions. Because it leads to uncertainty, and uncertainty leads to risk, and so on and so on. So I would avoid this as far as possible. But if it's not avoidable and you have assumptions stated in the scope, that may also lead to compensation events. So here's just a few. This is not all of them. Here's a few of the standard printed ones. So in clause 60.1, bracket 1, the project manager gives an instruction changing the scope. So that's obviously something the client is in control of. They're in control of the scope. The contractor has priced the scope that they were issued during the tender process. So any change to that, they therefore get an opportunity to price that change and alter the program accordingly. Here's a few others. The client does not allow access to and use of part of the site in accordance with the accepted program. So obviously the contractor has turned up, ready to enter the site with their low loaders full of machinery or whatever, and the gates are locked, they can't get in. So then their program has been interfered with, they have to reorganize their deliveries and their mobilization and so on, and that's not their fault. the client didn't allow them to site. So you can see here that definition that we had earlier, things which are client risks and are not the fault of the contractor. So we're talking about here about a change in mind or some sort of default by the client. There are some other things where a specified limit of risk has been exceeded. And what I'm talking about here is physical conditions and weather. So here, up to a point, these are contractors' risk. And then beyond that point, they become the client's risk and it triggers a compensation event. So the weather is fairly straightforward. Weather measurement is recorded that would occur less frequently than 1 in 10 years. So here you make reference to the weather data, usually supplied by the Met Office, at a place specified in the contract. So once that weather data has been exceeded, this weather is unseasonably bad, then it flips and it goes into client's risk. The physical conditions one is a bit more subjective because this talks about something that had such a small chance of occurring, it would have been unreasonable for the contractor to have allowed for it at the time of coming into contract. So, you know, they're putting in some piles and they've got some GI. Does the GI reflect what they're actually pushing the piles into? And if the GI makes no mention of rock and the contractor encounters rock, then it's probably unreasonable for them to have allowed for it. But if it talks about stiff clay and they have trouble pushing into the stiff clay, you would argue, well, what were you expecting? So physical conditions can be a little bit subjective, and that's where we use the site information to gauge what the contractor could have expected. Okay, so this is just a few to give you a flavour. As I say, there's 21 listed under clause 60.1. So you can go and look those up. Other terminology often gets used from other contracts. Claims is kind of comes from lawyers. It's kind of a legal term. I think variations comes from JCT contracts. We're working on an NEC contract, so let's get our head in the game. Let's start using NEC terminology. So we talk about compensation events. Okay, so risk allocation, as we go through time, hopefully as we learn more about our project and we narrow down on decisions and we mitigate risk, and also the time for risks to pass, the envelope for risk, if you like, it narrows. So over here at feasibility stage, there's like a base level of risk based on what you know about the project at that time. Remember, at feasibility, it's not that well developed. And you have a large envelope for risk. There's a lot of things that could change and could affect the outturn cost of the project. And as we move forward through outline design into detailed design, hopefully a lot of those risks have been removed through good design. That's the ethos of CDM. But when we get into contract, there's still elements of risk that remain, and this has been shared somehow between the contractor and the client. Okay, and then as we go through, risks are realized, so the outturn cost tends to tick up. These are going to be either contractors' risks or clients' risks. They get realized. So even though we enter contract with a total of the prices, the risk, the contractor's risk gets eaten up, but the opportunity for risk starts to pass. So that risk with the ground conditions, well, once you've finished the foundations, that risk has kind of gone away. So the envelope for risk narrows over time. We need to make sure that where we split this risk, this is to do with the client's appetite, and we need to offload onto the contractor those risks which the client doesn't wish to carry. And obviously, the risk is more shared if you go into one of these target contracts like C or D, and there's less sharing if you're in options A and B. The contractor carries more risk under A and B. So risks that the client wishes to retain should, in the contract, be compensation events under the contract. And there's a process for dealing with time and cost effects of these, or they should be clients' liabilities. There are some of these already stated in the contract under clause 80.1, and you can add in more through the contract data part 1. These are dealt with the same way that compensation events are dealt with. These client liabilities trigger compensation events, but there's a requirement for an indemnity by the client, and the contract has no need to insure these sorts of events. So these sorts of events tend to be the big things. This is war, civil war, rebellion, I think radiation, I think is under there. So it tends to be the bigger things for which you don't need the contractor to provide insurance. Otherwise, everything else is wrapped up into compensation events. And clients' liabilities are in the construction contract, and they're also in the term services contract, but not in the professional services contract, for those of you who are procuring other things other than construction. So in contract data part 1, it used under NEC4, it was called the risk register, but now it's called the early warning register. And it's in contract data part 1 from the client and contract data part 2 from the contractor. And there's a statement, and it says, the following matters will be included in the early warning register. And that was the risk register under NEC4. The important thing here is will be. This is future tense. Okay, so this demonstrates that anything you list in this section of the contract data is a post-contract management activity. So listing things to be recorded in the early warning register does not contractually allocate risk. So if you put, the roosting bats, okay, so roosting bats, I want to put on the early warning register. What you're doing there is you're giving an early warning. If the contract is otherwise silent, it's not included as a compensation event under a different section of the contract data, then the risk of roosting bats sits with the contractor. And if they put it in here, in this statement, in contract data part 2, it does not transfer that risk onto the client. Okay, it's often misunderstood, this section. I think it's probably one of the reasons that they changed the wording from NEC3 risk register to NEC4 early warning register to try and distinguish a little bit about what we're doing here. Okay, the early warning register is a register of the risks listed in the contract data and the risks which the project manager or the contractor have notified as early warnings. Okay, that's what it is. It does not contractually allocate risk. It's post-contract. Okay, and I realize I'm banging that drum quite heavily there. But it's really important because this gets misunderstood. It gets misunderstood in the procurement phase, and it gets misunderstood when we execute the contracts. And it's really important that there's nothing here about the contractor's tender document either. So whatever they write in their tender document also does not contractually allocate risk. Okay, the contractor often thinks it does, but it doesn't. Acceptance of the tender does not mean you accept any qualifications or sort of limitations that they put in there. They have to make their way into the contract documents. Okay, and then that also means be really careful with your tender clarifications procedure as well. So throughout the tender process, there have been some questions, and those questions have been answered. Those answers have to make their way into the contract documents as well. Okay, it's all about that allocation of risk. Why is it so important? Because we have to understand whether when that risk happens, is it going to trigger a compensation event, or is it just for the contractor to deal with? Okay, this is why this is so important. What about provisional sums? Provisional sums a bit more popular under JCT. Do they occur in the NEC? Well, you have to think about why. Why are we using a provisional sum? Why don't we know what that item is? So why can't the contractor price it without, a vague sum? Why can't they price it properly? Should you have a provisional program allowance to go with it? Remember from other bite-sized sessions how central the program is to the NEC contract. So if we're using provisional sums, we should also perhaps have provisional allowances in the program. The ECC requirement is to construct in accordance with the scope. So the contractor is deemed to have priced and allowed time for all of the scope. Provisional sums are not generally used then. There's no mechanism in the contract to use it. What you're introducing there is an ambiguity, which will lead to a compensation event. So it's instead better to state assumptions in the scope about what is required, and then when an assumption needs to be changed, then you can change the scope, and that will trigger a compensation event. Okay, so I guess you can still have things which are not that well defined in the contract and in the scope, but you need to be clear and highlight it. These things are not well defined for these reasons, so go ahead and price on this basis. And then when we know more about it, you change that basis, you change that assumption, and then that will trigger the compensation event. But you need to give your best possible guidance to the contractor throughout the procurement procedure, so that they have given you the best and most accurate price that they can. Okay, and just remember, there's just a quick note for you, any of you working on NEC3 legacy things, I keep talking about the scope here because that's NEC4, that's really what we should be using, but any of you still using NEC3 might be using the term works information. But remember now, we should be using the word scope for NEC4. Bit of bedtime reading for you here. I'm going to issue the slide deck as some PDFs, and you'll see these links. This is my good colleague, very experienced colleague, Richard Patterson. He's written a paper about managing risks and avoiding disputes. So here's a link to that for your bedtime reading. I know all of you are going to go away after this course and you'll be like, oh, I desperately want to read more about contracts. So here's some bedtime reading. Okay, so we've got through the procurement process. We've thought really carefully about who we want to carry which risks. What's our appetite for risk, or do we want more cost certainty, in which case the contractor carries that risk, but the price goes up accordingly. So we've had a really good think about that. We've had to think about all the risks that could happen, bats, birds, neighboring, schools or whatever it is. We've thought about all of the risks to our project as much as we possibly can, and we've ensured that they're allocated correctly through the contract using the additional compensation events in contract data part 1, or using those X clauses if they're appropriate. So we've got through all of that, and we've signed the contract with the contractor, and now we're ready to go. And as we go, we've obviously got the plan, and the plan survives for as long as you make first contact with anything. And then there's undoubtedly going to be some sort of change. So how do we manage change? We manage it with compensation events. So what does that look like? Okay, so it's all about change. Change means compensation events. How could this how can we have avoided it or limited it, or what is one of the #1 causes of change? It's a poor scope. The scope is either too vague or incomplete, or we changed our mind. It wasn't really what we wanted, so we've started to change our mind about things. Scope is the primary cause of change. So when you're going through that procurement process, put as much effort as you possibly can, make it as clear as you can and unambiguous. But I promise you, time that you spend writing and developing the scope, it will save you time and hassle and heartbreak down the line. Okay, so please work on your scopes. Okay, poor scopes mean stress project manager. Okay, who's going to deal with it? The project manager. The procurement process, the procurement team, they've done their job. You're into contract, they're away on to the next one. The project manager is now taking up that contract and executing it on behalf of the client. And poor scopes mean lots of change to manage and lots of decisions to be made and assessments to make. So how does it work? So the basic procedure is the project manager notifies a compensation event and instructs the contractor to submit a quotation. or the contractor notifies a compensation event, in which case the project manager has 1 week to say yes or no. And if they say yes, instruct a quotation. Okay, so it can come from the project manager and it can come from the contractor. And in fact, certain clauses have to come from the project manager or have to come from the contractor. If it's a change to the scope, that comes from the project manager. The client has decided on a change of scope and has said to the project manager, I've got a fresh set of drawings or whatever it is, send these to the contractor. So this comes from an instruction. The project manager instructs a change to the scope and says the following drawings are hereby added to the scope. And then separately, but almost immediately afterwards, they would write to the contractor and say, by the way, that instruction that I just gave you, that is a change to the scope. That's a compensation event. So please go ahead and produce a quotation for that. Or it's something that the project manager didn't know about and couldn't have known about. So, for example, the contractor is digging away and they encounter a UXO. They find an unexploded World War II bomb. I mean, the contractor couldn't have known about that. So the project manager certainly couldn't have. So this can only come from the contractor. So they notify those sorts of compensation events. When the contractor notifies, the project manager has to make this decision. Do I agree or do I not? And this is a yes-no decision. This has nothing to do with value. This has nothing to do with how much this will affect the prices, how much this is going to affect the time. It doesn't matter if this is 1p or £1 million. Is it or is it not a compensation event? And some of these, all compensation events have the possibility of affecting both time and money. Other forms of contract, they can have time-only events. Not so in the NEC. All compensation events are assessed for their impact on both time and money. So you might have some nil cost events. Again, it doesn't matter. At this stage, you're just making a yes-no decision. Is it or is it not? The value or the effects don't come into it yet. Right, if the project manager has either instructed or has said yes, the contractor has then 3 weeks to submit their quotation. When the project manager receives that quotation, they've then got 2 weeks to reply. Your response to a quotation is either, please submit a revised quotation. Now, you have to give some reasons for this, but there are no reasons under the contract. So this comes down to your experience and your opinion. It could be, I agree with these parts of the quote. I don't agree with these parts. Please re-quote them. Or you haven't provided any substantiation. So yes, you provided me with a quote, but I don't know why you're using these rates or these timescales. Can you explain it further? So revise your quotation. Or you could accept the quotation. You could say, yep, that's fine. I get it. And I agree. In which case I accept it. Or you can make your own assessment. So in this case, you're saying, I'm not going to go ahead with your quotation. I'm going to assess it myself. Now, in this case, the contract does give you reasons. And there are very specific reasons when and why you would make your own assessment. Okay, let's talk about dates in the contract. Let's just pivot onto program for a moment, because I'm going to talk about the effects on the program in a second. So let's just remind you of some of the program terms. This is not a program session, so I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly. But you can think about it. You've got the contract date when the contract came into existence. You've got your starting date. This is when the contractor then starts work. So this is when they have to provide insurances and things. You then got the access date, when you can release the site to the contractor. And then you've got the completion date. Now, this completion is a state of being, okay, and it's defined in the scope. And the more detailed you can make that definition in the scope, the better. So the completion date in italics is the one we first thought of when we signed up to the contract. So it either comes from contract data part 1 or contract data part 2. Either the client thought of it or the contractor proposed it and it was accepted by the client. Okay, so this is the one we first thought of. But as we go through the contract, the completion date can move through the implementation of compensation events. Okay, so if we implement a compensation and it has an effect on time, the completion date can move, but it can only move further into the future. Compensation events cannot bring the completion date closer to you in time. It can't bring it forward. It can only push it back. Okay, really important. So you can have compensation events which are negative in terms of money. So if you remove some scope, the total of the prices can be reduced. That's fine, but it can't bring the completion date forward. So you need to have a real think about your scope up front, because we don't really want to be reducing the scope later, because it doesn't limit the amount of time the contractor has to do the work. Okay, and the completion date is really important. That's the one we tie things to things like delay damages. The delay damages are tied to the completion date. So if the contractor is working beyond the completion date, they're in delay, and that's when they're going to get hit with things like delay damages. Then we've got this thing called planned completions. This is when the contractor is planning to finish. Okay, hopefully, as shown here, it's to the left of the completion date, which means they're planning to finish early or on time. And if it's to the right of the completion date, that's them admitting that they're going to be late. Okay, it's allowed, it's okay, but it's obviously not great news for the project. And then we obviously have our bars of all of the operations that make up the project. Okay. Now, the planned completion date is really important because that's the one we use to assess the effects of a compensation event. We assess the effect on the contractor's plan. Okay. And then if we move the planned completion date by, say, a week, then we move the completion date by the same amount. Okay, we would move that by a week as well. So any time that the contractor has got in their pocket between planned and the completion date, they keep that. Okay, that's preserved for their use. So we move those dates together. This is like this is called the terminal float, the time in between these, and that's for the contractor to use as they see fit. Okay, so compensation events, when there's change to the program, we assess the change to the planned completion date. Then we've got the date of completions. That's the date that we actually finish on, and that's decided by the project manager and certified. And then within 2 weeks of the date of completion, the client has to take over the site. Okay, and that's where risk transfers back over to the client. And then we've got our period, runs from the date of completion to the defects date. That's your year or 2 years or something of that order, in order for you to notify defects once the site is up and running. Okay, and then you've got some optional interim dates. So a certain condition has to be met by a certain date, but it's not the whole of the project. So you can insert those to make sure certain things are hit as you go along. Anything in italics is defined in the contract data, and anything with capitals is an identified term, and that's in the clause 11.2. If your project can be completed in sections, and that's what you want to do, you use option X5, and therefore all of these things also apply to sections of the work as well as the whole of the works. Okay, so makes your program much more complex, but that's because your project is much more complex. You're doing the project in sections, so your program is in sections. Okay, the program reflects the project. Worth noting, all of this applies to the professional services contract, except access dates and takeover, because we don't have a site in professional services contracts. Okay, but otherwise, if you're procuring services, everything else still applies. Okay, it wouldn't be an NEC session without a bit on program. So there, just to remind you of some of those things. Okay, so get us back to compensation events. A delay to the completion date is assessed as the length of time that, due to the compensation event, Planned completion is later than planned completion as shown on the accepted program current at the dividing date. Okay, which is like super wordy, right? But what are we talking about here? We're talking about how much has the contractor's plan been affected. So we've got a sequence of activities, and then we insert this event somewhere in that sequence of activities, and then the sequence then moves on. So if they were delayed by cold weather so that they couldn't pour the concrete, and that cold weather was unseasonable, like you wouldn't have expected it, it's beyond that 1 in 10 threshold, then obviously you insert, they built all the shuttering, they've, you know, the chippies have done their work, we've got all the formwork in place, the rebars in place, they were ready to pour the concrete, and now you've got this delay, say a 3-day delay. So they can't pour the concrete immediately, they have to pour it 3 days later when things are warmed up. So that 3-day delay shifts everything up. If that was on the critical path, and it shifts the planned completion date up by 3 days, then we move the contract completion date by 3 days as well. Yeah, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's exactly what's happened. They've been delayed, everything slides up. So that's what we're doing here. This is what they're trying to describe in a really, really wordy way. Okay, so we check what was on the previous accepted program, so what the plan was at the time. We introduce that event that's caused some sort of delay, and we use that in the assessment of time. Okay, but show the effect of the compensation on remaining work. So update the program first. So we get this thing called the dividing date. Okay, and in the NEC, because we sort everything out as we go along, we don't wait for a massive legal dispute at the end. We sort everything else as we go along. But of course, time doesn't stop. So we have to pick a point in time from where we're going to use the actual defined cost and the actual recorded events that happened. And then we're going to forecast beyond that event. So we have to pick a point in time. And that point in time is called the dividing date. Okay, we pick the dividing date is the date of the notification of the compensation event, and we use actual events, so actual defined cost incurred and actual delay incurred up to the dividing date, and then we forecast beyond. And this can put us in a little bit of a tricky situation because we notify the compensation event, and then we do the assessment. So the dividing date is already in the past. So when we do the assessment of that compensation event, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of that person at the dividing date. So what did we know then? Not what do we know now? And it can cause a little bit of tension because quotations can include for risks that have a significant chance of occurring. Okay, and we don't revise our quotations if that forecast is later demonstrated to be wrong. So we have to make our best guess at the time, add on some risk, implement that, and if things work out a bit differently, we don't go back and revise things. So if we think that dividing day is now in the past, and say we had that concrete pour, and they said, well, it's going to be 3 days delay, I can't be sure that the weather would definitely have warmed up after 3 days. So I'm going to put 1 more day of risk in. Okay, so we're going to have 4 days as the assessment of this compensation event. They produced that quote 5 days after the dividing date, and they've actually done the concrete pour. And we know for a fact that the weather did warm up. And so they only actually suffered 3 days of delay in reality. But they included a 4th day for risk. And we're like, yeah, but that didn't happen. Well, we know it didn't happen, but we didn't know that at the dividing date because that's in the past. What did we know then? Did we know then for certain that it was going to be warmer after 3 days? No, we didn't. You can't have known that. Yeah. So it causes this bit of tension, but you have to kind of put a little bit of your knowledge of what you know actually happened. You have to put it out of your head. And we forecast the effects on program and on the prices from the dividing date. Okay, and we don't go back. We do not go back. So sometimes when we assess these compensation events, they'll be assessed too high. We'll have put too much risk in, and the risk didn't occur, and then the contractor is like rubbing their hands because they pushed the total of the prices up, and then the cost that was realized doesn't come anywhere near that. So well done, contractors. Sometimes we assess it too low. We get a very, very keen price. Either we push them or we do our own assessment for some reason, and the price adjustment is very keen, and actually some risks did occur that were contractors' risks, and the cost was more than the price adjustment. And so the contractors lost out a bit there. So they're going to feel very hard done by. Don't worry, they won't be shy in letting you know that. But you need to just say, that's the way it is. Okay. Sometimes we'll assess these things too high. Sometimes we'll assess them too low. All right. You've got to just do the best job that we can at the time. Right. And that's what we have to keep coming back to. We don't go back. Okay. If we go back, we lose that whole benefit of sorting things out as we go along. And we're back into that, have a massive argument at the end of the project situation, which we definitely don't want to do. So we have to assess it as we go along, which means we have to make some sort of guesstimates and forecasts, but we do the best job we can and we don't go back. So the change to the prices is the actual defined cost of the work already done and the forecast defined cost of work not yet done, plus risk, plus the fee. Okay, quotations include for risk and they're not revised if forecasts were wrong. Note that we don't use the bill of quantities or the activity schedules. Okay, when we do this assessment, we don't use the bill of quantities full of rates and quantities, and we don't use the activity schedule, which has got prices against activities. We do an assessment of the actual defined cost occurred and the forecast defined cost, and we do that for all options. Even A and B are done using defined costs. Okay, so that's what we should do. It may make sense to use rates and lump sums, in which case this can be done by agreement. Okay, so you may use things from the activity schedule or the bill of quantities or some other rates and lump sums, but that has to be done in agreement between the project manager and the contractor. You have to say that is a sensible way to price things. Let's do that. Otherwise, the default is defined cost forecast for everything. Okay, so a change to the prices. This is what your quote is built up of. A change to the prices, the actual defined cost, plus the forecast defined cost, plus the fee. And this is in the form of a change to the activity schedule for options A or C, or a change to the bill of quantities for B or D. And if there is a delay to the completion date, they have to provide a program showing that change, and you use the accepted program that was current at the dividing date. And we update it to show work already done up to the dividing date, and then the effect of the compensation went beyond. Okay, and the dividing date is explicit. It's in clause 63.1. It's the date of the instruction by the project manager or the date of the notification by the contractor, because again, it depends where that compensation rate came from. Okay, cost of preparing quotations is no longer excluded under options A and B. It was excluded in NEC4, that's no longer. And the cost of preparing the quotations is included and has always been included under options C, D, E, and F. But to increase the prices, the contractor will have to show how preparing that quote has increased the defined costs. Okay, so have they had some more QS time that the other otherwise wouldn't have had? And that's similar for the consultant under the PSC. The consultant also needs to show how there's been an increase to the defined cost. There's a new compensation under NEC4 for proposed instructions that don't go forward. So Ordinarily, when you instruct a change to the scope, the contractor gets on with the work straight away. And at the same time, in parallel, they do the commercial exercise, they produce the quotation, okay, in parallel. But you get on with the work now. That's all well and good as long as the client has the money. But if you only want that change, if you can afford it, you're going to want to price first. And those things are called proposed instructions. So don't start work, but do the commercial exercise, get me a price first. And then if we're okay with it, then we'll instruct you to go forward with that price change. Under NEC4, you can instruct as many proposed quotations as you wanted, and you could have a whole army of QSs on the contractor side, feverishly working away to get you these proposed instruction quotations. And then you could go, no, 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 to every single one of them, and they couldn't recoup the cost of that. Okay, so now there's likely to be a small compensation event, but if you ever say no, it triggers a new compensation event, and they can recover the cost of preparing that quote. Okay. Project manager's assumptions. Okay, so because implemented compensations are not revisited, if it's very, very uncertain about how to price things, you might want to make an assumption to guide the contractor on how to price it. Okay, so they include for anything that's the contractor's risk. So you could state an assumption, and then that risk, you could take that away from the contractor and you could give it back to the client. Then you'll get a keener price through the compensation event, right? But the client is carrying that risk. If you correct that assumption, for example, because that risk has been realized, you correct that assumption and it triggers a fresh compensation event for the correction of that assumption. You still don't go back and reopen the old one. You do a fresh compensation event to account for the change in that assumption. Okay, so this gives us a lot of flexibility. So we can do quotations for proposed instructions, we can use assumptions, and we can also ask for alternative ways of dealing with the event. So you can ask for different technical solutions. So I need a retaining wall. Can you price it in, you know, secant piles and sheet piles? Because you don't know which one would be better or cheaper. Okay, so you can ask for that sort of thing. And you can use for rates and prices instead of using the defined cost, as we saw earlier. What happens if you don't engage with this process? The contract keeps things moving along. So the contractor has only got 8 weeks to notify compensations unless it was one that the project manager should have notified. Okay, so they've got a hard time bar. If they don't get their notification in, no compensation event. The project manager will do their own assessment if, and this was what I was talking about, the specific reasons why you would do your own assessment. If the contractor didn't give you a quote because they ran out of time, if they haven't assessed it correctly, now that's very much your opinion. Okay, so you better have good reasons why you think they haven't done it correctly. But you can just state that and then go on and assess it yourself. If they haven't submitted a program with their quote, or if the project manager has not accepted the last program submitted for acceptance, then, and this is mandatory, by the way, you shall act as stated in the contract, clause 10.1. So you will do this if any of these triggers. What happens if the project manager doesn't do their, hold up their side of things? So the contractor can remind you. And then if they remind you of things, you've got 2 more weeks to act. Otherwise, it's treated as automatic acceptance. So if they notify of you of a compensation event, you don't respond in 1 week, they remind you if they've done that reminder. So they have to do it. But if they've done that reminder, you get a further 2 weeks. If you still don't respond, automatic acceptance. And the same for quotations. If you don't respond to their quote, they remind you 2 more weeks. Otherwise, it automatically accepts their quotation. And finally, if you said you're going to do an assessment and you don't do it within the time that you're supposed to, they can remind you. You've got 2 more weeks to do your assessment. If you still don't, it reverts back to their quotation and that's treated as accepted. Let's look at these timescales diagrammatically. This sometimes helps. Some people view things a bit differently. So you've got a change. So a change to the works information, or rather a change to the scope under NEC4. So the project manager notifies, and you think about all these clauses. So which clause was there somebody's fault? Do I want alternative quotations? Do I want to include assumptions? You instruct the contractor to quote. They've got 3 weeks. They think about the change to the prices, delay to the completion date, risks, ambiguities, and so on. They've got 3 weeks to prepare their quote. It goes back to the project manager. They've got 2 weeks to review that quote. And then they give a response. If they accept it, it gets implemented. Happy days. If they say, no, I want a revised quotation, it goes back up. They've got 3 weeks to prepare it. You've got 2 weeks to review it. Hopefully now we can accept it. There we go. Or they gave you a quote, or they didn't give you a quote because they ran out of time. You go to your own assessment and then you implement that. Or it could be something that's come from the contractor. So they've got 8 weeks from when they're first become aware of that event to get their notification in. And that goes to the project manager. The project manager has then got 1 week to consider. Okay. And if they say no, that's it. It stops. No further progress. It's not a compensation event. End of discussion. The only way the contractor can challenge that is for adjudication. Okay, so big decision. If you say yes, it is a compensation event, they've got 3 weeks to quote, and round we go here. Same process, same timescales. And then over here are the sanctions. So if you don't respond here, so if you don't respond to their notification, if you don't respond to their quote, or if you take too long to do your own assessment, they remind you you've got another 2 weeks. Otherwise, it's automatic acceptance, or automatic acceptance of their quote. Okay, so you need to actively manage compensations from day one. That's the process. You need to be on the ball from day one. You need to agree that you want to manage them and monitor progress. You need to be clear in your processes and clear in the timescales in the contract. That's all set out for you. Just remind the contractor of that and set down and say, this is how we're going to do it. We need to look at the accepted program. We need quantity surveyors that understand cost and risk. And we need to agree a format for quotes so that they're arriving in a way that we're expecting and we understand. We need a way of working with the contractor for acceptable quotes. So there's nothing in the contract here that says negotiate, but obviously in the real world, negotiation happens. So we need those commercial meetings with the contractor. We need to discuss, negotiate, and come to agreement. Use the project manager's assumptions. Don't be afraid of those. Where it's appropriate, use them, because that helps us to manage risk better. You might want to roll up small compensation events, you might not. It depends how and when they occur, but of course you can agree. Look, here's 3-4 different small events. Let's tie them up into one event. Okay, so you need the will and resources to manage compensation events. So the client needs to give you adequate time, and you need a collaborative approach between the contractor and the PM. Okay, and routinely monitor the health of your project and routinely have commercial meetings. Keep to the timescales. The contract will punish you if you don't. And then for each compensation event, have a think about the subclause. Is it 60.1 bracket 1, 60.1 bracket 5, 60.1 bracket 12, whatever it is? Be clear which one are we talking about. And be clear on the desired outcome. So this is a change to the scope. Just be super clear. Okay. Discuss risks, obviously, and any change to the contractor's working or completion date, and what are the changes to the defined cost. That's the whole quotation process there. Okay. Review before the final submission. That helps with agreement of these things. So they could submit it to you in draft. If you want, that's not a contract mechanism, but they could do that as a real world working mechanism. And then you can review it in draft. And then you can, when it comes to submitting the final one, it should just be a fait accompli. Okay. And then why do we do all this? Just very quickly, I know you're all thinking about lunch. Don't worry, I am too. Why do we do all of this? Because at tender stage, we had a total of the prices and we had a completion date. And then as the project goes on, we start to edge towards that. We edge towards the initial target of time and money. And we've got the price of work to date. And here, compensation funds start to move it. But we know now where the new target is in terms of time and money. We know where that is. So as we edge towards it, we know where this target is moving to through the compensation event process. Okay, so as we get close to it, we know where that is. Imagine if we didn't do this compensation event process, the target would be down here. We've already exceeded it in both time and money. So we've spent more and we're late. Where is it going to end up? You've got no way of knowing. This is now in a big fog of legal action where the lawyers are going to get involved, and you don't know when you're going to finish, and you don't know how much it's going to cost. So by setting it out through incremental compensation events, we know. So when we get to the end, we know where we are. And then very, very briefly, because these things get mixed up, changes to the scope can lead to compensation events. Other events can lead to compensation events. Early warnings, which we've had from a different bite size, they may lead to changes in the scope. They may not, because you might early warn of something which then doesn't happen, right? Early warnings may precede compensation events, and the lack of early warnings may affect the assessment of compensation events. So they're linked, but they're not the same. And early warnings do not lead to quotations. Okay, early warnings may lead to compensation events, which lead to quotations. Okay, we need to show changes on the scope on the program. Change compensation events need to be shown on the program. Programs are used in the assessment of compensation events. And then once you implement your compensation event, that's then shown on the next accepted program. Okay, so lots of interlinking, but they're different things. Okay, and then more bedtime reading. We need, we need different cultures and systems because we sort out everything as we go along. We need the early warning process to mitigate risk, but we sort out everything now. So programs, forecasting, negotiation, and collaboration are all very important to NEC contracts. Bedtime reading for when I issue the slides is dozens of newsletters from Mott. Books, Managing Reality by Barry Treves is a very good book to help you guide you through NEC. And John's Broom's books are also very highly regarded in terms of helping you use the NEC. Okay, contact details if you want to get in touch with us. I'll send out the slides to probably Julie, who can then disseminate them further. I know I've run over 5 minutes, but that's the end.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Alec. I really appreciate that. I know we've got a few questions which have come through, which I don't know if we just want to take a couple of minutes just to quickly look at. I think some of these I know you've tackled.
Yeah, so, okay, what if the contractor refuses to provide additional detail on their quote or revised quote? You move to your own assessment. It depends how big a deal it is for you. You know, if it's a deal breaker, if you're like, well, I can't understand why it's so much money, and it's a large chunk of money and it's important, you go to your own assessment, okay, and you say they haven't assessed it properly. If it's small fry, then maybe you're like, look, I'm not happy with it, do a better job in future, but okay, we'll let this one through. So it kind of depends, and it depends how hard a line you want to take. And remember, the contract allows you to take that hard line, but you have to work with these people. So if you're going to, be really harsh on them, then we're going to lose that collaboration, and then you're going to have less of a nice place to go to work for the duration of the rest of the project. So think about when you want to apply the contract really harshly. The contract is always in your favor, it backs you up, but is it, pick your battles. That's what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
What if the key date is affected by the program delay, but not the planned completion date? Then it's similar. You affect, with key dates in the program, the contractor should already have a milestone of when they plan to meet the condition required by that key date. So you assess the change on when they plan to meet that condition, and then you would move the key date by the same amount. Okay. So you do it in a very similar way. If the PM instructs it to submit a revised quotation, does the time frame start again in its entirety? Yes, it does.
Yeah.
They get the fresh 3 weeks. So again, you have to think carefully about why you do that, because you might just be working up a massive backlog of quotations and not getting them through, not getting them implemented, because in that time that you've instructed them to revise it, they get another 3 weeks, another 3 compensation events have occurred, and now there's a big backlog of quotes that are building up. The contractor will get overloaded, but so will you when they all come through to get reviewed. So you have to think carefully about when you want to do that and why. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying have a think. But yes, they get their entire time. And how do Z clauses work? I had a project 2 years ago. The client inserted Z clauses to ensure no time delay. Well, so Z clauses are a bit of a nightmare. That one that you're talking about there, that is a total nightmare. Z clauses have the same weight and the same impact as any of the other core clauses. So if it's in a Z clause, you have to abide by it. I can't advise you because I don't know what your specific ones are. So you have to read through them carefully. And if this one, as we said, is there are no time delay costs, we're a CE only, and the actual defined costs for CE events, so they've changed fundamentally the way that your compensation events are assessed. So that's then what you have to abide by, and not the normal process, the one that I've explained to you.
I think I'd say that there's a massive health warning on Z clauses, because it gives a huge amount of power to the person drafting the contract. They can pretty much write whatever they like into a Z clause, but you have to really understand the contract if you're going to do that. And I've seen examples of Z clauses where the NEC contract is renowned for being easy to read, for having clean language, and then I'm stereotyping here, but a lawyer's got a hold of the contract and they've put in very, very technical wording, which sometimes that's been presented to me, and I've gone, well, I really don't understand the point of having that worded, because it's already catered for just using more easy to read wording in the core contract. So
yes,
you have to really understand the contract if you want to get into Z clauses.
Yep. So all I can say on those is good luck.
Alec, thanks so much for your time today. That's been really good. I can see we've had a huge amount of participants, which is really good as well. So it's great to see that people have taken so much interest in this. Julie, I don't know if you've got anything to add, but I'm sure otherwise, YORhub are running we run a continuous series of seminars on topics related to elements within the frameworks, and obviously the NEC is a core part of that. So if there are any particular requests for seminars in the future, do let us know. But otherwise, thanks so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And as Alec says, let's go get some lunch.
Yep. Good luck with your contracts, everyone. Bye.